Hey, welcome to Goblinization Day. Not exactly a national holiday, but make of it what you will. My suggestion is to stay inside today, and not mention if you start feeling under the weather. It's a bad day for running, chummers. Oh. Now, if that left you a little confused, don't worry too much about it. It just means that this is your first introduction to the world of Shadowrun. While it isn't one of mine, it's a hell of an awesome place to spend an evening. Unfortunately, that wasn't what I wanted to talk to you about today. Instead, I think I have a treat that you'll all enjoy. A few weeks back, you see, I was involved in a roundtable discussion on cultural appreciation versus appropriation, sharing versus stealing, essentially. While I have done talks on it when words collide before, that was with all writers. Here we had people of all different backgrounds. I'm a writer, obviously, but we also had yoga teachers and tarot readers. It was such a wonderful discussion that I wanted to share the whole thing with you. It's a bit long, but I loved taking part in it, and I hope that you'll all enjoy listening to it too. I do want to apologize for my avatar, though. Instead of the program I normally use, I was trying out animes. They started as face rig a few years ago, letting you create your own characters for online, but only with 2D characters. Now they're trying to let users add avatars like mine. I applied to be in their beta program, and I got accepted. So if I seem to be moving a bit weirdly or have weird shadows, that's why. As far as anime goes, I do love them, but I found that my head tends to move wildly around, and I vastly prefer the ability to avoid resting bitch face by using the program I use here. They have fixed a lot of it already, though. For example, the shadows, which are insanely dark in this, are nearly non-existent in the newer one. They still have a way to go, but it's one heck of a good start. Now, on with the show!
This is the conversation that we brought together is called Sharing or Stealing. And it is a conversation about when we are borrowing from another culture, when we are sharing another culture, or when we're teaching another culture. When does it become okay, and when does it sort of tip over into stealing, and when does it tip over into disrespect? And I think it's a really interesting conversation to have. And for me, it started off when I was listening to a podcast, and I found that something I did very regularly in a yoga class was called into question. So I thought, why don't we open up? Why don't we have the dialogue about whether these things are okay? So my name is Maxine. I am a yoga teacher in South Wales in Britain. And our 4 people who are joining the conversation as well is that we have got Carrie Besko, and she is a tarot reader, tarot teacher. And we've got Brandy Ackley, who, is that how you pronounce your name, Brandy? Brandy Ackley?
Yes, it is.
Great, okay. And then we've got Brandy Ackley, who is a writer. And then we've got Sheena of Spark of Life Yoga, and she's a yoga teacher, amongst many other things as well. And I'm sure you can talk a little bit more about your work if you want to join in the conversation. So the podcast that I was listening to, which particularly started this train of thought, was all to do with the word namaste. And in a yoga class, this word is used really regularly. If you go on YouTube, if you go to a yoga class, we do tend to end putting our palms together. We might even do the gesture and we say namaste. In the podcast, they were really interrogating the use of this word namaste. And there was 2 reasons and 2 opposing reasons. So the first reason was that almost as a sacred word, it has been translated literally to mean I bow to you. But to put more meaning on that, it means the light in me or the divine in me bows to or recognizes the divine in you or the light in you. So I'm honoring the fact that you have the divine in you, and I recognize that we are one and the same. And because a lot of people will go to a yoga class and not know that meaning, and they just use it almost like a hello, goodbye, does that make it a disrespectful use of a sacred word? Now, the other reason, and this has come up in other articles that I've seen, is that namaste is just another word in and I'm not going to say the whole of India, because obviously there's dialects and different languages, but certain cultural areas then, certain countries, certain districts in India and in other countries. So namaste just means hello. So when you're at the end of a yoga class, being very profound and very meaningful, saying namaste, it's almost as if you're exoticizing a word that just means hello, and you're using it incorrectly, because if it just means hello, why are we saying it as goodbye? So in my country, we do have our own cultural language, which is Welsh, and it would be like saying bore da, which is good morning, and ending a yoga class with and bore da, and it means it's completely out of context. And I have read reactions to this where people from an Indian heritage will say that they feel nauseous when they hear this word being used incorrectly. They've got to turn it off at the end of a yoga class if they're doing it on YouTube, or they just sort of get up and go before they hear that word just being used in a really profound way and being misused. But so there's two ways, there are opposing ways, but the yoga teachers that were talking on the class said that they felt uncomfortable using a word that they didn't fully understand. I'm going to hold off my opinion on that and whether or not I choose to use the word, because this is a time that I want to listen. And perhaps by the end of this discussion, perhaps I'll say what I think, but this is my time to listen now. So I put it out on Facebook, on social media. I want to have a discussion about this. When does it become okay to use language from another culture? When is it okay to use that other culture? And this is how this conversation has come about. So thank you very much for joining me. And what I'd like to say is that sometimes if we make mistakes, and perhaps me using namaste in this way is a mistake, we really kind of at a point now where discussion is shut down. So the word cancel culture is bandied about, but it really is. People lose jobs over asking questions, over making mistakes. And of course, they make much bigger mistakes than me naively using one word in a yoga class. But what I'd like to create in this discussion today is a place where we can make mistakes, where we can ask awkward questions, where we can say, I disagree, and there's going to be no recriminations, no loss of friendship. And actually, maybe we can just, sometimes you agree to disagree. And so we will sort of rules of engagement. You can say what you want. Maybe we can hold off on the swearing a little bit because we're hoping to record this and put it on Facebook. We'll probably ban us. But, you know, if you're a swearer, perhaps I'll just edit it out. That's fine. I won't get offended with that. And I think maybe we can interrogate the use of the word rather than the person as well. So that would be my other suggestion. Because I think sometimes I know that when I have been corrected, the most useful time for me has when people say, well, when I was in a situation, this is when I dealt with it. If someone comes to me and says, you did this wrong and you shouldn't do it, which is how I felt when I was listening to the podcast, I automatically kind of put up my guard and go, well, I will do it anyway, and I don't care what you think. So no one likes the you in attack. No one likes you doing it wrong. I think it's basic psychology. And I think if you do use, whether it's art, whether it is a holistic therapy, whether it is yoga, if you've used something that's been incredibly healing for you, very profound, and then you've gone on and created healing in other people and maybe created profound experiences in a yoga class or in whatever class or writing or artwork that you do, if someone tells you that that's wrong, that can be really hurtful. And I think if someone says to you, well, it's not about you, you're right, because it's about that other culture and that person that you're offending, but it is about you because you have to process that and you have to go through the stages of shock, I've done something wrong, anger, how dare you say that to me, or maybe anger at yourself, and then you kind of have to kind of go through maybe a reparation, maybe making it better, forgiving yourself. So there's a whole process that you've got to go through. And I think to say it's not about you is it's false. It's always going to be about your personal experience of the world. So this is what I'm hoping to do today, is just create a space for us to share our personal experiences, because it's always going to be through finding empathy. So let's go back to that word. I recognize in you, you recognize in me. It's all about living through our experiences and recognizing the humanity, recognizing yourself in other people. So that's how I think we're going to come to understanding about other cultures and our own practice and what we do. And so I'm going to very briefly just do some definitions, and then I think we'll move on from me. So culture, I've used the word culture. So what is culture? Culture can mean a few things. Culture can be a verb and culture can be a noun. So you culture a plant, you help a plant grow. You culture a person, you culture a child. So rather than thinking about them growing like you do a plant, you culture thought frames onto them, mind frames, you give them culture, you give them thought, you give them ways of thinking, and you give them ethics, you give them moral. So that's how you culture a person, you culture a child. When you come into different types of culture, you're either born into a culture and you sort of see through a cultural lens, almost like sunglasses, or you can experience a culture when you're older and you're sort of bringing that culture to yourself. But you're always going to see the lens through the culture that you've grown up in. It's really hard to break away from your personal culture, but you can take on other cultures. For example, if you get married to someone with a completely different culture to you, it's going to be inevitable that you're going to pick up that sort of thing. If you've got one side of my family is so multicultural, it's inevitable that I'm going to pick up certain things if I go stay at auntie's house who cooks in a certain way or speaks in a certain way. So culture sort of comes upon you as well. I call this sharing and stealing. The proper words for them, I suppose, or the theoretical words for them would be acculturation and cultural appropriation. And let's get a definition on those words. And there's a really great article by someone that Sheena knows, she was really good to share that with me, which is Carrie Quinn. And if I've said that wrong, if it's more of a Carrie Quinn, let us know. And perhaps I'll put that up as well so you can read it. And acculturation means that when you sort of soak up a culture without realizing, because you're in that culture, you're experiencing it, and it's a very positive experience. So the example that Carrie gives is that if you go and stay with an Italian family for a year on an exchange, you start to cook in the way that Italian nonna does. You maybe you start to gesture a bit more because that's what, Italians do that quite naturally. And this absolutely is true. I spent a lot of time traveling. I spent a bunch of time with Spanish-speaking people. They were actually in Puerto Rico. We were in Spain. So I was involved in the Spanish culture. I didn't speak a lot of Spanish, but I started to dream in Spanish. My internal dialogue in my head, I spoke with a Spanish accent because I spent so much time with these Italian people, these Spanish people. So that just and I started to get little habits. Maybe there's certain cooking things that I do to this day, which are a little bit Spanishy, the way that I cook food. So cook paella, for example. So yeah, that was my example. I was like, yes, I can really get that idea of acculturation. Cultural appropriation. So that's when you take something that's distinct to a culture, such as art, religion, and you exploit it. And you'll exploit it usually for money, or you'll exploit it for recognition. And I'm going to give you a list of examples that are commonly used, that I've read or that I've heard. And I'm not saying these things are good or bad. I'm saying these are what other people have said. This is cultural appropriation. So a Black woman is criticised at work for her hairstyle. But when a white woman wears the same hairstyle in the same place of work, people will, the Black woman might be asked to change it because it's ethnic or it's not appropriate for work, and the white woman will be considered cool, fashionable, and will be applauded for exactly the same thing. An artist will copy a Native American textile art pattern. They go there, they copy it, they put the design on a t-shirt, and then make a whole lot of money without any recognition from either the artist or the culture that it came from. And another example would be wearing a ceremonial religious garment to a Halloween party, not respectfully, and just there to get drunk and just look silly in it. So cultural appropriation in yoga, I'm just going to talk very briefly about that, and then I'm going to move on. So cultural appropriation in yoga, it might look like using an Indian style name, professional name if you're white, only doing the movements of yoga and not the philosophy, only speaking the English translation and not the Sanskrit, using the Sanskrit names without proper pronunciation or knowing the meaning, for example, chanting sacred mantras, taking on the yoga and Hindu culture and feeling it is exotic, feeling it's special, and therefore you are exotic and special, but it's not your culture. And then learning this cultural practice and then making massive business out of it without any heart. So these are things that people have told me. Again, no judgment. I'm not going to interrogate them. I'm just saying this is what I've read. This is what people have told me. And some of them contradict as well. So, and we've got to acknowledge here that when we do yoga, that India was a colonized place and horrific things happened there as well. So people went there, they exploited the people, they killed the people, they exploited the land, they took resources. And if you go there and then it's 100 years later, but if we're still doing that to culture, there's a cultural memory there. People remember their grandparents talking about these things that happened. So I think it's a little bit, I don't think time will heal all things. I still think we've got to recognize the fact that it's, you know, that the West went in there, or Britain specifically went in there, and there was a colonization process. So I'm going to end there. I'm going to pass it on to Carrie. I think you've got some really interesting things to say about your area of work, haven't you? So it might be slightly different, but I think it's still along the same theme.
Yeah, thank you. So my name is Carrie, and as Maxine said, I read and teach yoga, or tarot, sorry. I'm not used to wearing my headphones and I can't hear myself talking back to myself, so it feels very strange. So I live in British Columbia, specifically on the unceded territory of the Lakamo First Nations people. And I also, my experience as far as being immersed in cultures other than my own was, I worked for quite a few years with Indigenous communities with a nonprofit organization. So I was lucky enough to be immersed in situations I wouldn't have otherwise. So I really got a firsthand look at that. And it really is easy to you know, leave feeling so inspired that you want to take that with you when you're out of community. And so I guess even recently, just like, you know, just continuing using sage and all the things I'd use in my practice for so long, just actually learning more about that. And even just this week, you know, preparing for this conversation, there's so many things I think we do in our practice that we've done for so long, we haven't questioned where it came from, how it might appear to anyone outside of, you know, outside of us. So, so there's a lot of work to be had there. I think with tarot specifically, it's really tricky because there's, you know, a lot of, there's the Romani people who basically brought it to light as far as a divination tool. But then, you know, there's about 600 years of tarot kind of being immersed along the Silk Road. So there's, as far as finding a distinct history in it, it's really tricky. So what I've tried to come to peace with in my own practice is to do my best to not hold myself up in a certain area of tarot where other people can't, or to take opportunities away from people who can't practice because of their race or their ethnicity. So, and just trying to, go through that whole know better, do better. Like, as I learn things that aren't responsible as they could be, to just discontinue them and to find newer, better ways. And I thought of when I no longer work with that organization, but what I felt like I came away from it with was culture envy, because, you know, being, you know, a settler, I've got all kinds of the inappropriate term I think was Heinz 57. I've got, you know, Polish, Ukrainian, French. So seeing a culture that's so immersed and that the children take part and everybody knows the songs and they celebrate before meals and they always put out plates for their ancestors. And there was so much beautiful ritual and appreciation around everything that they did, that you know, when you step back into white culture where it is quite dispersed, you can kind of take that feeling of wishing for that in your own way, and you know how to bring that forward. So I heard one of my favorite speakers, an Indigenous speaker, referred to it as self-location. Like, a lot of people with settler history, trying to find that place that they feel rooted to can be really hard because they don't grow up immersed in it. They don't learn about their ancestors necessarily. So yeah, I've been doing a lot of thinking of that. I don't know if that's necessarily helpful. I was thinking about what you had said too about, you know, having people come at you about that kind of thing. And I think to share one of the helpful ways for me too is when someone will ask me a question like, oh, where did you learn that term from? Or, you know, making me kind of stop for a second and think, oh yeah, like, you know what, I don't know. Or, you know, asking questions, I think, is another great way to open up dialogue rather than feeling very, you know, attacked over it. So but yeah, as far as the history of tarot, it's borrowing from a lot. So I'm still trying to find out how I do my best to. I know recently there was a bit of an ordeal of like the ghetto tarot decks. So people are trying to include more diversity in tarot decks now, which is amazing. But then you also have to watch, I believe, if I remember this correctly, the person who created the ghetto tarot deck, which featured all these beautiful images of African-American peoples, was white. And so she was making this, you know, an insane amount of money on this deck, which, you know, featured diversity, but it also wasn't her place. Like, if she had given that money back in some way, or like handled it a bit differently, that's another I think looking at how yeah, when people bring inclusivity into their practice, but just making sure that they're also not using that as a tool, as you mentioned, for recognition or for wealth. So yeah. I think that's all I have to say for now, unless anyone has questions or.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? Because I suppose that you do sort of have to question your place, don't you, of that you want to open up that your particular area of, and let's call it interest then, and is it your place to do it? So for example, I'm quite interested in bringing yoga to different types of people. So for example, looking at modifying for people who are not able-bodied, so doing sort of chair poses or giving variations. And then you've got to sort of ask, well, is that my place too? Maybe there's probably some fantastic disabled yoga teachers out there as well. What I should do is sort of highlight their work if people are out there. So yeah, it's interesting to find that balance, isn't it, to sort of being inclusive.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes it's maybe down to intention. I mean, was that woman thinking, I'm going to wrap it up here and get some money out of this? Or was she thinking, well, actually, I want to see diversity in my decks. I don't know. I don't know what it is. I don't know what her intention was. But
yeah.
I like to think the best in people, I suppose. But
for sure.
Yeah. And maybe that we've got to ask these questions. Maybe it's, you know, ask for difficult questions or ask the questions that need to be asked.
For sure.
Brandy, so I don't know, Carrie, if you want to sort of have a think about that, and I'd love you to come back in before the end. Brandy, I'd love you to tell us about the work that you do, because you're a fiction writer, aren't you? So you create worlds, you sort of create your own cultures, don't you?
Yep. I'm Brandy Ackley, just as a quick introduction. And yes, I create worlds with words is my little tagline that I always use. In particular, I usually end up writing about characters from cultures not of my own. My own heritage is Polish, Ukrainian, and English. So very, very European. But I found very early on in my life that I had a deep interest in the Asian cultures, and pretty much started researching them very, very early on, before I even turned 20, I'd say. And now, 20 years of full research into the cultures later, yeah, I feel that I can actually write into the stories, and I can actually get into that mythology, that mindset. So yeah, that's generally what I do. I think for me, it's all about respecting the culture it comes from. Japan in particular is very good about not really seeing cultural appropriation as a bad thing, because they don't see it as appropriation. You're appreciating our culture, that's great. But yeah, it's all actually respecting where it comes from and knowing where it comes from, and that way you can know what you can use, what you can't, and how to make use of that so you're being respectful to the original source.
Yeah, I've not been to Japan, but I've got friends, a couple of groups of friends who've been to Japan, and they said that they love the culture. And I think people were very good at gently correcting. So they quite enjoy the process of dressing people up in the kimonos and explaining the history. And as you're walking about, if they find that you're wearing it slightly incorrectly, they don't mind coming up to you. And my friend said they slightly adjusted her and said, oh, well, it has to be this way, more on the back than on the side.
Oh, yeah, they do that.
Yeah, but it was done in such quite a gentle, loving way, a very polite way, rather than just kind of shutting down and going. But I can understand when people in other cultures, so for example, you can imagine the First Nation or the Native American cultures, who constantly see their religious headdress, dresses and their clothes and their textiles being misused. And I can just see why they would just want to shut that down and go, I'm just exhausted with explaining.
Part of that to me seems like it might be not just because, of course, they're being so exploited, but also because for their cultures, anything can be sacred, depending on what the object is, how old it is, what happened there, when they had it, so that sort of thing. Which means that we could be taking it, and nobody who checks is actually doing the research onto whether or not that is sacred or not.
Yeah. Yeah, and I remember the 90s where everything was a mishmash of wearing different sort of Chinese symbols and Native American, and I remember, and you're nodding, you're probably of the same sort of, you remember that time where we very naive, you know, it was very naive, wasn't it, that we were just go, oh, I love it, I love the pattern, but we didn't ask because we didn't have the cultural sensitivity that we do now. So I think it's,
well, yeah, we you don't know, and you have to improve, and you have to get better. At the same time, I feel that we can go a little bit too far to the other side, with a lot of people saying things like, no, you can't even look at other cultures. And to me, that's when your culture starts stagnating. You have to have a give and a take. Otherwise, no, your culture will stagnate, and it's pretty much been shown throughout history that when your culture starts stagnating, that culture starts dying off.
I agree, Brandy, and I think that particularly, I'm only going to talk about my area of the world, because I do think that, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, I think America to me seems quite tribal, so they do quite like to categorize people and go, I'm from this culture, you're from that culture, and we respect and honor, but maybe we won't cross cultures. I think sorry, Brandy, go on.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, and specifically, yeah, for once again, the Native Americans, there are so many different cultures, and people just try to monolith it together.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I'm using the word as if there isn't vast differences in between different, you know, regions and different areas.
Exactly. That's why I suggest, before you take anything, to do your research. Look at what the people is, what the history is. You can't mistreat something you can mistreat something, but you probably won't mistreat something if you know the history of all of it and where it's being used by other people and all of that.
I think too, we have to also look at, are these people still being oppressed for their celebrations? Like in Canada, you know, you get people saying, why aren't First Nations people more open to reconciliation? Well, they're still being oppressed. They're still, you know, receiving medical inadequacies. The last residential school was only closed in, I think it was 1995. So this is recent history. So, you know, as settlers, we get impatient. We want to fix it. We want to make it better. But we also need to have a period of time where we stop doing the things that, you know, so I think that level of oppression is part of it too. Like if a culture is experiencing being shut down or held back and unable to celebrate something that we as white people are celebrating openly without danger or any kind of repercussions, then I think that's territory we need to look at, maybe.
Yes, that I completely agree with. That's another part of the respecting the culture that you're taking it from.
Right, exactly.
You have to. I made a comment, or my husband made a comment that I put onto the original thing, where you may have your yellow bias, and looking at another culture, you'll see a blue, like theirs is blue. But once you respect it, you can actually see in that green. You can understand both and where they mix, where the overlap is.
Yeah. That's one of my favorite stories about when you look through your own cultural lens. It's like wearing sunglasses. So you might wear the blue sunglasses, another culture will wear the yellow sunglasses. And when you spend time with each other, you can never see blue, but you might start to see in shades of green. And what did your husband say about the shade of green, which I love that. Like,
that was how you combat racism, specifically because, of course, you're not saying that blue doesn't exist or that the problems of blue aren't there. You're saying, I understand that they are there and that I can't process, and that I'm not qualified essentially to judge their experiences, but I can look at their experiences and sympathize and try and learn from my own lessons from it.
Yeah. I've got a couple of things that other people have said to me. They couldn't stay up till 11 o'clock, but they've given me some written pieces. So I will share them with you.
Okay.
There is a lady who comes to my yoga class whose name is Judith, and this is what she said about sort of sharing culturally. She says, I believe that any practice that is of value to us as humans should not be ring-fenced. Anything that helps to bring about an improved quality of life for people ought to be willingly shared. When I can consider a couple of the world's greatest people, such as Nelson Mandela, Mahatma Gandhi, or Aneurin Bevan, who is the founder of the British NHS and happens to be a Welshman, so Aneurin Bevan, they all worked tirelessly to improve the lives of others and inspired many other people on the way. Just as importantly, they too were influenced by others and would often include a person from outside their own culture. And she goes on to say, so specifically about yoga, physical yoga practice has much to offer in keeping people supple, flexible and healthy. We know that physiotherapists will offer patients stretches and exercises that are closely related to yoga and help people improve their health following significant injuries or illnesses. Other fitness regimes such as Pilates recognize the benefits of physical yoga and have adapted many of the postures and included them in their sessions. Although there's much to be gained from physical yoga, I feel the benefits are increased by following the philosophy of yoga also. So what she sort of said to me in a roundabout conversation is sometimes doing the physical yoga without the philosophy is going to give you benefits. And should we ring fence that and go, no, you can only do yoga if you recognize the whole of the cultural history of yoga? Or can you do that small aspect of it? Because I know there's some people who come to my class go, no, I'm Methodist Christian. I have no interest in learning about the stories of the Hindu culture. They're a nice story, but I don't kind of want to take that on, and I don't necessarily want to take on the spiritual lessons. But I very much enjoy coming here for the social aspect and for the physical benefits. I sort of personally think that you should be respectful, but I sort of see physical yoga practice as a gateway, like a gateway drug to the spirituality of yoga. So I don't think any of my yoga students come to me thinking I want to learn how to cleanse my chakras and kind of reach enlightenment. Very few, maybe one or two perhaps, but I do think go on.
Sorry, I just wanted to say there, I think part of that would be how are the actual people who originally did it? Are they willing to share it? Are they happy to share it?
Well, I did ask. I've got a neighbour who is from Indian heritage, still very much in touch with his Indian family, and I'm one of those nosy Welsh girls. We talk to everyone where I come from. There's no barrier. So I just kind of went over to his little shop and I said, right, I'm doing a talk tonight and I want you to tell me about your perception of Western white people doing yoga practice. And I don't know if it's just the generation, but he just didn't really get the conversation. He didn't understand the question. And it's not a language thing. He just didn't understand the idea of cultural appropriation. He just was like, well, you know, if people physically want to do yoga and they got the health benefits, that's fine. And I said, well, do people in India find it strange that we're doing an Indian practice? And he said, well, in India, sometimes the rural people are just too busy to do yoga. It's more the people in the city who do yoga. So he just didn't quite get that. I wonder sometimes, are we asking these questions and fretting and worrying? And actually, you know, my neighbour who is, I think he might have even been born in India, but he's definitely, you know, he's still got the accent of where maybe that's just sort of his, the background that he lived in when he was, he lived in a city, but got a strong Indian accent. He's really involved in Indian culture. And he was just like, I don't understand the question. So I wonder sometimes, are we kind of peering at our own navel, you know, unnecessarily?
I think in this case we might be. Of course, like I said, I don't know anyone from India, so I can't say specifically there. But if they are fine with having it shared, then we shouldn't be the ones stopping them from sharing it.
But also we have to watch saying they as a whole, right? Because there's people who are rooted in Indian culture who are not okay with us doing it. And there's a whole spectrum. And I think that, you know, that's where it gets interesting, because we have all the, you know, this varied. And I think it's just, showing that respect, being open, like, sorry, I should have written it down. I had a point before and now it's gone. I'll think about it and I'll
well, actually, Carrie, I think you're absolutely right, because actually someone has come to me and said, and it's sort of on behalf of someone, saying that and interrogating my yoga practice and saying, well, what sort of yoga do you do? Because I have a Hindu friend who really has a problem with people doing yoga as an exercise practice without the philosophy. So there are people out there,
Mm-hmm.
you know, that come from that background and use yoga as a spiritual practice. So do have a problem of people saying, I do yoga lattes without any
Right.
sort of, you know,
Yeah.
Sheena, your friend Carrie Quinn, if I'm saying that correctly, she writes some fantastic articles, doesn't she, with this sort of thing? Do you want to give a little summary? Do you feel, yeah?
Well, so first I wanted to chime in a little bit on it and say, you know, I think a lot of times part of the problem is that we're assuming that all people should be the same in the sense of where they are in their journey. When we're talking about yoga, yes, there are 9 limbs of yoga. And for the most part, a lot of the people in the Western world will do the physical aspect and maybe some of the breath work, maybe meditation. And so that leaves off all the other branches of it. But I think part of the problem is that some people just aren't going to get to that point no matter what. It's kind of like, in a sense, if you picked something, because yoga was somewhat religious in that sense. If you go to Christianity, you have some people who go to church on Sundays. They're happy, they're fine. They're not very devout. They read the Bible occasionally, maybe. And then you have other people who go like every night of the week that they can. Or you have people who are like Mother Teresa, who go so far above and beyond that she's out there living this. She's walking the talk. And so I think that's part of the problem too here, is that originally when it was created, it was taught in ashrams that was very, very specific. It was set so that certain people would get accepted in, and they would be, in essence, but I hate to use the term slaves, in the sense that they would do all the work for the ashram, and that was called seva, which was like volunteer work, what we would call volunteer work. But it was their way of paying for their teacher to teach them. And that created a dichotomy where you have somebody who's so far above and you have somebody who's so far below, which sometimes that's okay. But when the world starts changing, regardless of whether you're trying to steal something or not, how many times do they actually have ashrams that are really like that now, even in India? Probably not as many as there used to be, because now money has become a very, very important exchange. It's not about, I'm going to teach you something and you're going to learn it and you're going to take care of my needs, like, you know, gardening and stuff, so I have food, and helping to bring water so I can bathe or whatever. Now money has been introduced. And so that becomes a very big factor for a lot of places. So when you have something like that that's introduced even externally to them, it changes even their internal world. It means that everything is completely different for them too. So I think it still creates that issue of, now you have some people who are just kind of, I don't know what you want to call it, just kind of willy-nilly. They're trying it out, they're checking it out, and they're dabbling, and they're okay with that. And then you have some people who are much more interested. They do the yoga every day, and they do meditation every day, and they're working on some of those other aspects, and they understand what the niyamas and the yamas are and everything like that. And then you have the people who are going out there and they're just living that life and maybe teaching too, kind of like, there's one that I think a lot of people would agree with. She may not be on the order of Mother Teresa, but Sean Corn has been doing a lot of work, and she's very popular because she's international. So she's very well known, I should say, not necessarily popular. And she's been doing a lot of work to give back to communities, not only just teaching. So you have that various range that really, I think, is where a lot of the crux of this issue is, because there are just some of those people who are just dabbling like anything else in the world. You're on mute, Max.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just agreeing. Yeah, that's true that you've got those different levels, and I think sometimes maybe we should allow those levels as well. I guess that's that would be my argument, is that if someone does just want to come once or twice a week and not really kind of go in, for me that's okay. I think maybe for other yoga teachers, plus perhaps between them and their conscience, whether they want to be around people who are all in, and I guess perhaps that what you do in your space is just allow a level of respect in that time in talking about yoga practice. I know that in my classes people come up to me, and I don't know if you've heard about it, there's the, I don't know whether I should say it actually, I can always edit it out, there's a certain fitness branded exercise that will use Tai Chi, yoga, Pilates, but it is all about fitness. And people will come to my class and go, oh, you should go to this exercise class. You'd love it. It's really famous. And they do yoga. And I go, oh, they do yoga inspired exercise. So, but I can recognize as well that yoga as exercise has only really been about 150 years, because yoga, asanas, I think the word asana just actually means to sit, doesn't it? So we use physical yoga practice, but actually because we're all quite fit, unfit and unhealthy, because we're not doing physical exercise like we used to do a couple of 100 years ago. We're not planting our garden. Well, some people are planting their gardens, but you know what I mean? It's not our job to go and plough our fields anymore. So we need to heal the body through physical exercise in order to meditate, in order to kind of become more spiritual. But I can recognize that. But then I can also recognize that when someone says, oh, I did yoga in this branded fitness class, it's not yoga, but I can respectfully say that, and I go, sounds really good, sounds really interesting. Yoga inspired classes, because we do yoga here. But my yoga teacher, who is in her 70s, she wouldn't stand for that. She'd go, it's not yoga. She'd probably speak a little bit stronger than that, actually. She'd probably put some curse words in there as well. But she tells people quite strongly that it's not yoga and they should stop calling it yoga. But I'm a little bit more open, I'm a little bit more forgiving. And I think sometimes you've got to pick your battles. I don't know, does anyone else agree with that? Sometimes when we're talking about the use of making someone say yoga exercise instead of yoga, is it the right battle to pick? I think, Carrie, you spoke so eloquently about what First Nation people have to go through, and if someone mispronounces a word incorrectly, yes, correct them, but should we really go to town on these people who might speak it in a public sphere? Can we pick a better argument and something to highlight? Because I've heard yoga teachers being really called up on the fact that they say certain Sanskrit words incorrectly, and I think, is that the battle? Could you have done a bit more of a polite way in a private sphere?
Yeah, what I was going to say before that I'd forgotten about is the other thing that I'm trying to keep in mind as well, is that people of color from all different cultures are the emotional labor they've had to do so far trying to educate white people. They're exhausted. They don't want to talk about it anymore. So I'm actually at a place now, because I was getting all excited about this and I want to put together a course. And I'm also wondering where the most appropriate way is to, I was thinking of inviting people on to talk about it, like people from their own culture, but then that's also, again, putting the onus back on them to talk about this, so I think I was curious what all of you thought about that. My idea was to find people who are already doing that and direct people to them, rather than ask them to speak about it, like find people of color, find people who represent that culture, and people who want to know more about it, direct them to, because then that increases their business. It gives them, because there are people that want to speak about their own culture and they're not, they find it invigorating rather than exhausting. But I know it can be so tempting to go to someone, and then ask them about it. But that, it's kind of our responsibility if we are going to borrow these things, or, even just moving through life as a white person, I've had to very humbly realize how many things I get away with that a lot of other people wouldn't. And I think if you can come at it from a place of being humble and open and curious, I think that's a really good first step.
I remember a friend of mine, Calvin Jim, another author of mine, was talking to me one day, and he was like, you would get away with so much more in your books than I would ever get away with, because he's actually like Chinese. But I was like, yeah, I can. And I guys kind of hate the fact that, yes, I would.
Yeah, it's hard to own that, but it's also a really important step forward. I think
It's also hard for, I think, people of my generation, at least here in the US, we were taught not to see color. Literally. It was
totally.
just, you know, there's no difference between them. And it might also be a matter of fact that I live in Colorado, which is very, I'd say very white, and not very diverse, at least in the area that I grew up in Colorado Springs. Yes, there were people of color in my classes. And again, it wasn't anything different. They were just kids in my class who happened to have a different color of skin. And
For
so
I grew up like that too.
You're probably the same age that I am then, I bet.
Yeah.
And so it's that difficulty of trying to see what other people have experienced and understanding that and trying to respect that, and at the same time recognizing that you don't treat anybody else differently. And trying to figure out a way to make everything right when you feel like you haven't done anything wrong because you yourself have not treated anybody differently. Yeah. And it does come down to some of that fact, like you were both saying, that simply by the fact of me not having color in my skin, I have received things that I never knew I received.
Yeah. And I grew up with my parents are very the opposite. They're, you know, a lot of racial slurs, and I spent all of my years at home fighting with them about that. And so when I was out on my own, I didn't very much like that. I didn't question it. I thought, well, of course I'm not racist. I fought against it my whole upbringing, and, you know, now I'm living the way I want to. And I didn't see color either. And it took, actually, it's fairly recent where I've really started to recognize that about myself, that no, I'm not racist, but I have to acknowledge that I am benefiting from being white. And it's a tough pill to swallow, but
part of that is, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Finish what you were going to say first.
I was just thinking it's a tough pill to swallow, but in a way it's really freeing, because then I can finally I can finally open myself up to learning. Like, I think when I wasn't allowing myself to think that way, I also was missing out on a lot. Like, I had a lot of shadow things creeping in that I didn't, you know, I hadn't acknowledged because I hadn't actually swallowed that pill and said, okay, I'm going to start from here. Yes, I've fought racism my whole life, but that still doesn't mean I'm not privileged, you know, like and I found it humbling and actually kind of refreshing when I finally made peace with that.
I was just going to when I was about to cut in, to say that was sort of how everyone was taught. There is no difference between us. That's the way to get rid of racism. But what they were doing was saying there's only one color of the sunglasses there. The blue color doesn't exist. Just ignore it. It's not that's the best way to pretend it doesn't happen. So yeah, it's that thing again where you have to be able to look at other people's perspectives.
Yeah, I think there's so you guys are making me think now that by saying, because I know that I've got two sides of my family. One side is that Welsh side, so we've got a very distinct culture, and actually in some ways it's a minority culture. Our language was suppressed for a long time. Children literally up until early 20th century would wear signs around their neck in shame if they spoke our home language at school. But on the other side, my maternal mother's side is very multicultural, and so we've got family all over the world, different cultures, different religions, different colours, and that's something that I really do have to check. And again, being brought up of that era of we're all the same and don't see colour, but I have come across people who have corrected me on that and have gone, no, I want you to recognise my colour, I want you to recognise my culture. So that is always something that I'm kind of treading, I guess, because in my family, you kind of, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. So if I go to my auntie's house and we all have to pray and then go to church on Sunday because we're staying the weekend, that's what we did. I didn't think twice about it. You know, if I have to go to another family's house and an auntie's house and they cook me some strange ethnic food, that's fine, I'll eat it, whatever. And so again, I didn't quite see it. It's just what we did. And we were never afraid of interrogating that. So if my uncle was being rather sexist because of his cultural background, we just call it out and go, well, and Uncle's a bit of a knobhead because that's what he does. And we'd never be afraid to kind of, you know, censor ourselves, because in our family we'll always fight for the underdog. We know we've got that intention of love. They're our family anyway. But yeah, it's really, I suppose, for people of our generation, it's that kind of trying to peel back that and trying to understand, is this the right direction that we go in? Is that, you know, yeah. And I think, and I'm sure maybe it's a white culture thing that we can, I think it's definitely a British thing where we can hold several different cultures in one identity. So I can hold that. I would say I'm of Christian culture because I still celebrate Christmas, Easter. I still go carol singing, and I don't feel any shame or anything about that. I can also hold a yoga culture, and I don't see the sort of clash of that. There's also a very much a pagan sort of culture in my area of the world. The next village over on New Year's Eve, they take a horse's skull on a stick and they go around kind of wassailing. So that's very much of a kind of medieval pagan practice, you know. And I can hold those things. I don't see the disjointedness. But, and it's almost as if then we're saying, oh, but one more culture won't matter. And I guess what you're doing is that you're not recognizing that culture might be going, actually, we don't want you to take us on. This is ours. Are you going to, don't collect us like Pokemon, you know, is so I guess you've got to be kind of respectful that even though we feel that we are being respectful actually for other cultures, we're not. I don't know if anyone wants to respond on that or if anyone can relate or disagree.
I absolutely agree. I think if we keep coming back to, was this culture oppressed for this practice? So like, to be totally transparent, my husband and I had a Dia de la Muertes wedding. We wanted to, you know, honor our ancestors, and we didn't really have anything in our, and looking back on that, I'm just horrified because I could do that openly without any kind of repercussions because I am white. So aside from people from the culture saying that's not okay, no one who came to the wedding even questioned it. And yet, you know, for a long time, people had to do that in hiding. That was their own culture, and yet they couldn't celebrate it openly. So I think if we look at, yes, we can hold all these things, but if one of our pieces is going to be something where people are being oppressed and the people that comes from are unable to practice it themselves, then I think we have to be careful there. I think that's the one place where, or it's just worth learning more about, you know, like if we know that those people have suffered greatly for that practice, then does that make sense? I feel like I'm not being very articulate, but
yeah, and
you're being very articulate.
Yeah, there was a phrase that you used earlier on, which I that's going to stick with me, and I think it was you, Carrie, and you said, learn better, do better, I think was the phrase that you used. And
know better, do better. I've been hearing that this week as I'm reading about for this talk. I kept saying that, and I thought, yeah, that's a good way to go forward. I think we can't undo things we did wrong at the time. Like we're all, especially as white people, we're going to make missteps, we're going to make blunders, and especially when we're trying to evolve and trying to get better, we're going to do it wrong. We're going to, you know, make mistakes. But I think as long as once you realize it's a mistake, you just don't keep doing it, right?
Yeah.
And I think learning is the most important part of that.
Totally.
You need to actually try and actively learn about the cultures that you're taking before you take it.
Totally.
And perhaps when we're thinking about, we're taking this on ourselves, because as I said, it's a very personal experience that you're going through and you're learning about. And perhaps we should sort of think about the way that we will in turn take that on to other people and teach other people. I think there's a big thing about trying to take the ego out of, well, I know, now I know, you know, and trying to tell people in a very kind way, in a loving way, that, you know, this is what we knew and this is what we know now, and perhaps we're going to do things a little bit differently. I think should do differently. It's a hard word to tell someone else, isn't it? Because as I said, sometimes when you're upending what people have thought for a very long time and practices that people have found very healing, I think it's hard for people to take that on. Then, has anyone come across an instance in that you've had to tell someone else that what they've done is wrong, or? No, it looks.
I mean, isn't that what Facebook is? No, I've tried to, what I try to do is if I see somebody post something that I know is quite problematic, I usually try to message them privately and just
Okay.
put a bug in there. I don't like the shaming. I don't like when people go on there and, tear them apart. I think it's worth mentioning to them because that could be the beginning of their journey. They may have had no idea. And just by you handling it that way, by saying, you know what, I just wanted to say that this might, you might get some feedback. Here's a resource or something, then that might actually be really productive for them. But, shaming them in front of their friends and family on their main page is, not the best way to do it. But that's where I tend to see most of that is on social media as far as like things. And I really try to only correct, because I'm still learning too. So I try to tread carefully there. It took a while. I used to be quite combustible on social media, and I realized how non-productive that is. But I think if you're gentle about it, and if you don't shame the person publicly, then I know that's the best way as far as that kind of interaction goes. In person, I haven't run into it as much that I can think of, but I live in the sticks. I live in the forest. So.
We sort of.
And I don't think I've ever experienced anything like that. Where I've felt the need to correct anybody in particular. And some of the time it's because if it is on social media, everybody else is already ganging up on them. And so sometimes I'll message them privately and say, look, I know where you're coming from. I see what you're saying, so that they understand that they're not alone. It's because I agree. I don't think ganging up on them and publicly shaming them is going to help any. It's just going to put them on the defensive, and they're going to run away and not want to talk about it, which is the worst thing, because what we want to do is open that dialogue. Because I know in one of the groups that I was in, they were talking about their practices and stuff, and everybody was jumping on them, and it might have been something as simple as the sage, like you had mentioned, Carrie, or something like that. And so I messaged them privately and I said, here's the thing, for a private practice like that, only you know what's right. And you don't have to make it public if you don't want to.
And I think I was watching a conversation talking that what you're describing there is actually cultural appreciation, like where you see something that you respect and you do it in private without looking to gain from it. And I think that's the main difference. It's when you're out and you're smudging other people and, doing this very sacred Native American and Indigenous ritual that you're supposed to be, indoctrinated into, but doing it in your own practice. I mean, I think I don't see the harm there necessarily. I mean, I guess with sage because of accessibility issues, but private practice I think is a totally different thing.
Yeah, it's not like you're the person that you knew was then going out and claiming themselves to be a sage expert and making money from it. I think sometimes it is intention, isn't it? And I wonder how much arguments are really done in the real world, I guess, rather than on social media, because as I said, I don't think I've ever really had a really huge philosophical argument with another yoga teacher, because for the most part, I think most people are trying to do good with the tools that they have, with the knowledge that they have, with the tools that they've been given. And I think it's really lovely to be able to share. I mean, Sheena knows that I've got a very different yoga practice, but in going to Sheena's yoga classes, that I've learned a different style of yoga. And I've said to Sheena, I'm going to take bits of your practice and then sort of put it into mine, because it's all learning, isn't it? It's about appreciation. And I'm talking about an aspect, a very small aspect of a yoga practice, but it's sharing, it's appreciation.
For sure.
Yeah. And I think with you, Carrie, as well, as you've sort of learnt more about the background of tarot, I'm going to one of your classes now. So that you're sort of feeding that back to me, and the knowledge that I had no idea about, the kind of the history and the background of tarot.
Yeah, and it's actually interesting because I just launched the course last fall, and I've already made so many edits to things that I did either misspoke or used the wrong term for, and so I'm learning as I'm doing it too. So I think what you're doing here, like this very thing, bringing people together to talk about it, is probably the best way to move forward.
Yeah,
really helpful.
And I hope with things like art as well, art is always a difficult one, isn't it? Because all art is stolen, as they said. So when it comes to Brandy's work, where you're very much influenced and you really appreciate a culture and you want to write with that cultural background, with that cultural appreciation. That it's,
Well, yeah, it really is one of those things where you have to look at everything.
Yeah.
People are always like, you're writing fantasy. It must be so wonderful to just create from whole cloth. I'm like, you need to have the inspiration, and you get those from real cultures. And then you need to know where those real cultures use them, how, why.
Yeah.
And you never know, because someone might be coming to your book and listening more about that culture and think, well, actually, perhaps I'll go back to that original culture and I learn more about it. I mean, I certainly, because I read Brandy's books, I'm desperately waiting for next. I was a big fan. And then I've gone back and I've talked to my friends who've gone to those cultures and gone, well, what was it like? What were the sort of things that you did? And I can sort of see the links there between, yeah.
I'm glad I got that through.
Yeah, it's very authentic, and obviously there's a fantasy element, so you're going to change things up, of course you are.
Oh yes, I always take, and I don't want to say cherry pick because I don't really cherry pick, but yes, I am going through and going, I wanted to grab this part and this part to try and create something new.
Yeah.
Well, I think we are pretty much bang on an hour now. Does anybody want to do you want to go through and sum up any thoughts? Do you want to take a moment for reflection? I don't know. We have our audience member there. Do you want to speak? Do you want to ask questions? Quietly watching. Do you want to type it? Do you want to speak it? I'll open up.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think there's two aspects of this culture thing. When you're actually living within a culture that's new to you, like Maxine said, you kind of absorb things unconsciously, whether it's language, phrases. When I lived very many years in the Welsh valleys, and even now, although I didn't pick up the Welsh accent, it's phrases, terminology, way of looking at things that I've absorbed without knowing that I'd done it. And every now and then I do come out with a little bit of Welsh, and which people look at me like I've got two heads. And I think, no, I can't do that. And I tried consciously but as a white person growing up in the 60s and 70s, with a very multicultural family, no, we didn't take any notice of people's differences. We enjoyed people's differences. We might have taken the mick out of each other and had a laugh and a joke, but in a very light-hearted, bantered way, as families do. But I find myself as a white person, I suppose that the American term is very much white privilege. I find it a very difficult concept because I've never looked at anybody else differently. And it's something I'm just beginning to try and get my head around as to what is my culture, because you've got Asian cultures, you've got Indian cultures, you've got Black American cultures, you've got Black African cultures, different cultures all over the world. What actually is my culture when I'm surrounded by all this other stuff? And I'm finding it more and more difficult to actually think, well, because I've moved around all my life as well, I've never had settled roots. So I don't feel like I have a culture of my own. It's just a mishmash of all sorts of things I've absorbed over time. Would you agree with that about me, Maxine?
Yeah, I feel like I got more of a sense of roots and home because I did stay for so long in one place in my childhood. So, and I can hold that Welsh identity as well as the kind of mishmash of your side, my maternal side. And I think with our family as well, I think the reason that we sort of go, oh, have we really got white privilege, is because in our particular family, there isn't really a distinction between, for example, white people and darker people, or lighter people and darker people, and areas of success. Because in our family, you're right, there wasn't a border then. We've got quite successful people and sort of, or less successful people, sort of in all ranges of our family. So it's not like we looked at someone and went, oh, well, you're not privileged because, you know, you come from that culture or you're that ethnicity. So I can see how it's sort of a process that you come in to understand. And, you know, just because you haven't experienced it or your family hasn't experienced it, it doesn't mean that other people of colour haven't. So it's that recognising other people have had different experiences. And do you have a particular culture is the question that you asked. Yeah, I think that you've got that, you've definitely got that English, that British, that Southern English, Southern softy. But now you're living in the Northern England.
That's very strange, because I lived the first 12 years of my life in the South.
Wales, yeah.
I'm now 60. 12 years out of 60 isn't a whole lot of time to absorb a Southern culture.
No.
And because our family is very much spread all over the world, we don't have that strong base anywhere. And though we care very much for each other, we're not sort of together as a unit.
Yeah, and I suppose you even lived in Norway for a while, didn't you, Mum? So it's not as even as if you stayed in Britain as such, you know, you moved to different places. I suppose when it comes down to that, it's about shared values, isn't it? And ethics. And we definitely have particular values in our family. So
yeah, that's a family thing as opposed to a wider cultural thing.
I don't know. I think ethics and values are definitely part of culture, talking from a cultural perspective. I mean, I think there's certain things that are really distinct to our family, like our obsession with helping the underdog in a way that no other family would understand, literally taking people in off the street sometimes. I think people do have a love of animals, but our family go above and beyond. We're
a bit obsessive.
Yeah. And that goes across our family, definitely a learned thing. So I think there's, you know, there's values and ethics are definitely a cult. I suppose I see what you're saying. It's a cultural thing to our family, perhaps, but is it a cultural thing to a particular country? But then people take on a culture. When I lived at university with this girl she called herself an atheist, but she was Jewish. She said, I'm of Jewish culture. My grandmother made her way across Europe and escaped the Holocaust. A lot of her family died, and that was her family culture, was Jewish, but she wasn't Jewish religion.
Yeah, but that's
but what I'm saying is she was displaced from her homeland. She was displaced from growing up, because I think she moved around, but she had a culture.
But is that more of being part of a particular race of people?
Well, yeah, I suppose.
Whereas in our family, we can't call ourselves a particular race. We're not.
No.
We're mongrels, all of us. Bless us.
Thanks. Yeah, very true. I don't know.
You're creating something new and trying to make something better from the pieces that you have.
Yeah. And I do think about, you know, if you're where I mean, for you guys, you're teaching or creating fiction or whatever from other people's cultures, as long as it's done with respect and you're not doing it in a way that demeans that culture. I think it can only be a good thing, because, as you say, I mean, cultures absorb from each other all the time, from close proximity. And taking the best of each other is a two-way streak and can only improve humanity.
Yeah.
I think I just thought of one thing that helped me with the whole white privilege thing, because it took me a while to, you know, years maybe, to really like fully embrace it. But when I was working with the Indigenous communities, what I witnessed that I didn't even think of is that a lot of these Indigenous people who are what they call white presenting, so they don't look Indigenous when you look at them, even within their own cultures, they have to make peace with that. They have to be humble enough to say that, yes, I'm, you know, whatever culture or whatever tribe it is they come from, but I also have to acknowledge that I don't present that way, so I won't face the same kind of racism that my family members do. And I can imagine, like, if someone actually from the culture has to make that peace with the, you know, the privilege they're getting because of the way they look, then certainly I can. Like, I had never even considered that until I was in it, and then I was like, wow, that's a lot to. I can't imagine, you know, being raised in that culture, having it be such a strong part of your identity, and still having to make you know, make that realization that you're still benefiting because you don't look like you're from your culture, which blows my mind. It's for a whole other topic, but I thought that was one thing that helped me.
I have, which probably sounds a bit weird, when I'm living in Wales for many years, Wales is quite racist towards the English in a lot of ways, you know, excuse my French, but as we say, I was always, you know, it's always, oh, the bloody English. And being surrounded by Welsh people with this attitude, I mean, quite often it was a bit of a light-hearted way, but there's still this underlying resentment of the English for the treatment of the Welsh over the centuries. So I do kind of, but for the era I grew up in, I'm a fair bit older than you guys, it was a class thing in Britain, that it was a class privilege, and you had your working class, your middle class, and there is still to a certain extent, but it's not as entrenched as it used to be. So I can empathise with other cultures and the way they feel, because coming from, well, lower middle class family with working class roots, you could see the differences, and the way people dress, the way people speak, the way people look at each other. It's not as strong now, but you've now got the north-south divide. Anybody south in southern England thinks the north are uncultured, whippet racing, flat cap wearing, strange people, uneducated. So England is a very, very strange kind of, although we absorb lots of people from all over the world, so we're very multicultural, we have that other layer of it as well. So there's a lot of things to pick through for somebody of my generation or my mother's generation in understanding each other. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I can even just imagine Gran being here. She's passed now. Oh, by the way, I was laughing, by the way, not because I was just thinking of the people that we know that are flat cap wearing.
No, you can laugh. It's all right.
I'm laughing at our friends who fit that stereotype. Again, this is our family, that we will laugh at anything because we own it, is us. Yeah, and I can just imagine Gran being here, actually, she's passed now, and going, why are you all talking about this? Let's get to the real issues then. But it is important, I think, to talk about them and to understand, and I don't think we even have to commit to a conclusion as we sort of come to the end of this discussion. I think it's really good that we've all come here and been very open to listen to each other. And we don't have to agree. I mean, there's certainly things probably that we're disagreeing on, of how far do we take it? How far do we question? How much do you pick it up with other people? But I guess as long as we do it with intention and with love, and question our, like you said, our own heritage, or where we come from as well. And as I said at the beginning, sometimes you get shut down with it. It's not about you, but I think this has been a really good, healthy thing to actually make it about you, and to interrogate yourself and ask these questions of yourself as well as
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's good to question your presumptions of the world,
sure.
particularly the world that you've kind of grown up in. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, anyway, thank you.
Well, it is past midnight here, so it's past midnight here. It's 12:15. So like Cinderella, I can feel my outfit slowly turn into dish rags. I can open it up. Does anybody want to end? I'm really happy to end here. Oh, look, I think your doggy's missing you, Sheena.
Always. They never get enough attention.
So
Ever.
cute. So.
Oh.
I would like to say thank you to Maxine for having such a great conversation and inviting us to be on for today.
And what I'll do as well is that I will put up your web pages, because I think it'd be really interesting for people to go back to those and just have a look at what you do and where you're coming from. So I think that'd be really useful for people as well. So we will pop that up somewhere on there. on the edit. Okay. Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining me.
Thank you, Max.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
So I will end it here, and in Wales, well, we could end with Namaste. In Wales, we'd end with Noswaith to you lot, because you're probably coming up to evening, and it'll be a Nostar from me, which means good night. All right. Okay.
Nostar.
Shall I say? Oh, there we are. She can't speak Welsh. Shall I kick us? Shall I end? Shall I kick us all out?
Yeah, go on then.
All right then.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
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 And that was it. I thought it was a great discussion, talking about cultures worldwide and how in each of our professions we tried to learn and find out more about the cultures we owe our livelihoods to. In my own writing, I can say that while I have drawn a lot from my love and research of Asian cultures, mostly Japanese, I have also studied Brazilian, Native American, Greek and Roman, Romani, even Norse cultures and mythology. The creatures and cultures in my novel are not based on these real-world cultures, but inspired by them. I try to create something with the same flair that's also uniquely mine. I always say that the first place you should start is with respect to the culture you're learning from. And that's it. Keep an eye out for next week when Chapter 2 of the read-along comes out on Wednesday. And I think Friday's going to be a doozy too. So keep an eye out for that. See you then. Bye.